The Laughlin and Stark model of religious conversion is one of the earliest and most cited stage-by-stage models of conversion. Here's the story of the bizarre cult that led to the creation of this model. It's the 1960s. It's a time when music is shaping culture. The youth have freed themselves from the previous generation through drug use and a liberal use of the word love. It's a time of vans down by the lake, communes, and helter-skelter. And it is within this cultural soup that a cult emerged. A cult which gave the world one of the most influential models of religious conversion. This cult was founded in Korea in 1954 by a man named Chang. Chang called himself Lord of the Second Advent. The cult was named the Divine Precept, which refers to a revelation Chang received from God. The precept claimed that the world would be reshaped into a second Garden of Eden by 1967. After 5 years, Divine Precept was at the height of its swing, with over 5,000 converts in Korea. One such convert was Miss Yoon Suk Lee. Here I'm going to give a quote from the biography of Yoon Suk Lee, given in the study titled Becoming a World Saver: A Theory of Conversion to a Deviant Perspective. Here's what the paper has to say about Miss Lee.
During her early teens, she was subject to fits of depression and used to sit on a secluded hilltop and seek spirit contacts. Shortly, she began receiving visions and hearing voices, a hallucinatory pattern she was to maintain thereafter. Her adolescent mystical experience convinced her she had a special mission to perform for God, and at the age of 19, she entered a Methodist seminary in Japan. She was immediately disenchanted by the worldly concern of the seminarians and the training she received, although she stuck out the 5-year course. Prior to entering the seminary, she had become engrossed in the spiritualistic writings of Emanuel Swedenborg, who soon began to appear to her in visions. Her estrangement from conventional religious roles was so great that upon graduating from seminary, she, alone among her classmates, refused ordination. She returned to Korea at the start of World War II, and by 1945 was professor of social welfare at a denominational university in Seoul. In 1949, the Methodist Board of Missions sent her to a Canadian university for further theological training. There, she wrote her thesis on Swedenborg, who continued to visit her in spirit form. In Canada, as in Japan, she was bitterly disappointed by the neglect of things of the spirit, caused concern among the faculty by constantly hiding to pray and seek visions, and occasionally stole away to Swedenborgian services. Her spirits continued to tell her that she was a religious figure of great importance. Returning to her academic life in Korea, she fell ill with chronic diarrhea and eventually nephritis, both of which resisted all medical treatment. After 2 years of this, her health was broken and she was completely bedridden. At this time, her servant took her to see Chang.
After her encounter with Chang, Lee's health recovered, and she was convinced it was a miracle performed by the religious leader. Miss Lee quickly became a devoted follower of Chang and set sail for America as a missionary to spread the word of divine precept to a university town on the West Coast. Despite her zeal and charisma, Miss Lee labored for 2 years and received only 5 converts. One of the difficulties Lee had to overcome as she formed the American branch of Divine Precept was the understandable pushback she received by the local Christian church leaders. But this wasn't just because she was bringing a strange new religion into town. It was also because 2 of her recruits abandoned their husbands and children in order to follow Miss Lee. As a result of the scandal this created, the town rose up against Divine Precept, and Lee, along with her followers, packed up the cult and moved to Bay City, a few miles south. The move proved fruitful to the Divine Precept. Bay City was a major metropolitan hub, far larger than the college town where she started. Lee and her followers made the move at the end of 1960, and the Decade of Love was just beginning. Given the rising zeitgeist and the metropolitan location, the cult tripled in size in just 3 years. And by the end of the 4th year, they multiplied tenfold again. By the end of 1964, the cult numbered 150 members. The model that Divine Precept adopted was pretty standard for cults and communes of the time. The cult migrated, but they always lived together in adjoining flats or buildings. The members took menial jobs wherever they moved, and they pooled the money to support the commune. Miss Lee did not take jobs. She lived off the revenue the others provided and devoted her time to running the lives of her followers and organizing evangelical efforts. When they weren't at work, the members were expected to devote all of their time and energy to spreading the gospel of God's new revelation and recruiting new members to increase their revenue and spread the new gospel. Divine Precept taught that God would descend to earth and convert the earth to theocracy, ruling along with a host of spiritual entities. Chang had sent Lee with the modest mission to convert all of America to Divine Precept. Chang was confident this would happen because the world must be entirely prepared for the coming of God just a few years in the future. It was about this time that Divine Precept had blossomed enough to attract the notice of a local researcher, Rodney Stark of California University, and his colleague from Michigan, John Laughlin. Noticing the rapid rate at which the cult was expanding, the 2 researchers saw Divine Precept as the perfect microcosm in which to observe the process of religious conversion. Unlike a sleepy Methodist church, which might gain a convert or 2 a year, new members were being added to the Divine Precept daily. And with such a high rate of conversion, it was the perfect petri dish in which to watch the religious conversion process. The 2 researchers met no resistance at all when they approached Miss Lee about observing the cult in action, both from the inside and out. The 2 had carte blanche in entering the commune, watching religious services, and interviewing members, both new and old. The 2 researchers did not restrict their work to just the compound and its members. They interviewed clergymen, officials, neighbors, employers, and others in contact with the recruits, and also talked to people who nearly recruited but decided to back out. The first thing that Laughlin and Stark noticed about the members was how similar they were in demographic. Divine Precept may have been a cult originating in Korea, but the members were entirely white people from the lower middle class. Even though Lee had planted herself in a large city, her members were mostly from small town origins. Some had college training, but nearly all had Protestant roots, like Lee herself. Doubtless this was because divine precept was founded on a Protestant understanding of God in the Bible, but simply preached that the Judeo-Christian God had spoken to Mr. Chang and told him that the heavenly kingdom would soon return to Earth. As the two researchers entered the cult and began speaking to the members, they noted that there was already seeds of suspicion and distrust brewing within. Cult members noticed that some people said they were converts, but they did not give up everything, begin living in the compound, and start donating all of their time and money to the cause. These Sunday saints didn't even do the work of evangelism so central to the goal of converting America, and were regarded by core members as interlopers, impossible deceivers. This was an immediate obstacle to the researchers who had begun the enterprise with the goal of studying religious conversion. But the question immediately arose, if there are members that say they're converts, but the church doesn't see them as converts, do they qualify for the study? To get an idea of the kinds of people who eagerly joined the cult, let me tell you about a few of its members. Bertha was born to a couple of German immigrants and grew up in a small town. As soon as she could, she abandoned the small town and headed the big city with her eyes on fame and fortune. She attended a modeling school, hoping to find her way to the spotlight. Her dreams of fame and fortune never materialized, so she dismally returned to her small town and married a boy who worked at a menial job at a printing plant. On her wedding night, she locked herself in the bathroom and refused to come out and consummate the marriage. She was never happy with her bedroom duties as a wife, and she and her husband would routinely separate and then reunite. Eventually, the couple did have 2 children together. The family moved from the small town out to the wide world of the California coast. And shortly thereafter, Bertha began to have private religious experiences, meeting God and talking to saints and angels directly. She became convinced that she had become a pure vessel, completely cleansed of all corruption. She eagerly took her experience to local clergymen, but they regarded her as a kook and advised psychiatric help. After this, she was ripe for the picking and eagerly joined Mrs. Lee's cult. The cult began to fill with individuals who had religious hallucinations and were convinced that they were God's vessels of worldwide sanctification. Many of the members had private religious hallucinations and had experimented sexually in a way that was not socially acceptable, even in the 1960s. One member, a girl from Possum Trot, Arkansas, dropped out of school in elementary, began dating at age 12, and was married at age 15. This girl began to feel stifled, staying at home and caring for children all the time. She attended local tent meetings, fell to the floor and spoke in tongues, and eventually abandoned her children and her husband for this exciting new cult. Another member, Elmer, had flunked out of college after 1 semester. He joined the army and flunked out. Elmer considered himself an inventor, but couldn't put together anything. And he considered himself a scholar, collecting a library of books, but was nearly illiterate. One particular passion of Elmer's was the paranormal, and he subscribed to magazines like Fate and Flying Saucers. Elmer couldn't talk to other people. He would simply whisper and look at his shoes, forgetting what he was saying and tuning out of the conversation. Elmer was convinced that he was destined for great things, but couldn't make any of those things materialize. This should give you some idea of the kinds of people the cult attracted. All of these people felt they had problems in life, and the cult became the solution they were looking for. But why this particular cult? Perhaps the members can explain in their own words.
I was reared in a Pentecostal church, and as a child was a very ardent follower of Christianity. Because of family situations, I began to fall away and search for other meanings in life. This began when I was about 12 years old. From that time on, my life was most of the time an odious existence with a great deal of mental anguish. These last 2 years have brought me from church to church, trying to find some fusion among them. I ended up going to religious science in the morning and fundamentalist in the evening.
In April 1960, my wife and I began to seek a church connection. We began an association with Yokefellow, a spiritual growth organization in our local church. My whole religious outlook took on a new meaning and a broader vision. I grew emotionally and spiritually during the next 2.5 years. However, as I grew, many spiritual things remained unanswered and new questions came up demanding answers, which Yokefellow and the church seemed not to even begin to touch upon. My wife and I became interested in the revelation of Edgar Cayce and the idea of reincarnation, which seemed to answer so much. We read searchingly about the Dead Sea Scrolls. We decided to pursue Rosicrucianism. We read books on the secret disclosures to be gained from yogi-type meditation. The more we searched, the more questions seemed to come up. Through Emmett Fox's writings, I thought I had discovered a path through metaphysics, which through study would give me the breakthrough I longed for.
My religious training consisted of various denominations such as Baptist, Methodist, Congregationalist, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Catholicism. Through all my experiences, I refused to accept religious dogma, because it was truth I was seeking, and not a limited belief or concept.
It should be clear that, at first, Miss Lee's cult attracted the disaffected and marginalized, with its promises of spiritual significance and belonging. It was at this point that Laughlin and Stark advanced their now famous model. The model consisted of 7 stages, each of which led to the other, meaning they built on each other and you could not skip stages. The first stage is a feeling of tension in your life, like something is wrong or persistently stressful. The second is entering a problem-solving mode to try to deal with the stress, during which religion is one possible solution. Now that you're in the problem-solving mode, you become what they call a seeker, meaning that you have to open your life to the possibility of exploring religion. Then a turning point in life comes, some significant change or event, and during this time, the person encounters the religion in question. They encounter the religion, and then they form a bond with a member or members of the religion. After this, previous bonds, like family and friends, diminish to some extent to be replaced with bonds with the religious members. Finally, the individual becomes an active member of the religion and is then deployed as an agent of that religion. And so Laughlin and Stark published their paper, and the rest was history. But what became of the cult? Well, culture began to shift as time progressed into the 70s, and the cult had to shift with it. Suddenly it became fashionable for young people with upper class from college campuses to rebel against their parents and others. And divine precept began to attract members simply because it was trendy to do so. Miss Lee's cult persisted for over a decade, well after the deadline for the coming of God to Earth. And so, subsequent revisions of their belief became necessary. The doctrines of the cult continued to change and convolute in order to explain away all of the inconsistencies. Eventually it became bizarre and nonsensical, or as Lee described it, mind-blowing. This became an obstacle for the cult. Originally, they had a rather simple message. take your existing religious beliefs and add to them the fact that God is coming back in 1967. But now the religious beliefs had become so absurd that any attempts to evangelize and give a naked and honest summary of what they believed were destined to scare people off. So Lee adopted a tactic of evangelizing first, then gently revealing each of her doctrines one by one in a logical order so as to commit the convert before educating them. As converts were gradually eased into the bizarre doctrines of the cult, they didn't seem so bizarre. As the divine precept gained a more affluent following of wealthy and educated youths, they began to collect funds, running into the millions of dollars. Lee and her followers began to invest this money into media blitzes and evangelistic campaigns. And for a period in the 70s, divine precept became a household name. But as the rebellious youth movements of the 1960s began to disappear into the 70s, the initial appeal of this exotic cult began to yield to a sort of distrust, slowing the cult's expansion. And the media efforts had no success. So Lee's followers began to adopt a different strategy. They called it picking up. Divine Precept evangelists would pick up every hitchhiker they could find, migrate through bars and other casual public places in order to begin harmless conversations, and put up modest little display tables on college campuses as a way to engage students. Divine Precept missionaries would make friends and invite them to dinners or lectures, denying any sort of religious implications at first. Or they would infiltrate other religions and begin picking off churchgoers they identified as likely converts. Here I'm going to describe one of these dinner events as quoted from the paper Becoming a World Saver Revisited.
The prospect arrived for dinner to find 50 or more smiling, talkative young people going about various chores. The place exuded friendliness and solicitude. He or she was assigned a buddy who was always by one's side. During the meal, as phrased in one report, various people stopped by my table, introduced themselves, and chatted. They seemed to be like sorority members during rush. Members were instructed, indeed, to learn all they could about the prospect's background and opinions, and to show personal interest. In one training document, members were told to ask, "What do you feel most excited about?" Write down their hooks so that the whole center knows in follow-up, and others continually complimented him. "You have a happy or intelligent face." "I knew I would meet someone great like you today." "Your shoes are nice." "Your sweater is beautiful," and so forth. The feeling, as one ex-member put it, was likely to be, "It certainly felt wonderful to be served, given such attention, and made to feel important."
One branch of the Divine Prospects specialized in sending attractive women into universities to flirtily invite professors to, quote, science lectures. One of these lecture forms evolved out of the movement's roots. The Korean leader of the movement, Chang, was convinced by the would-be inventor Elmer to tape record lectures and place them in the New York City Center. No longer were the members of the cult living together in a commune. Most had their own residences and lived outside the cult, but with the monetary affluence of the cult, they had purchased a sizable piece of land for their work called The Farm, and would hold religious retreats there, mostly for the purposes of recruitment. The principles of the group were all fairly familiar to religion. Things like sharing, loving one another, working for the good of humankind, and community activity. These were the principles, but not the doctrines, which were confessedly bizarre. At the evangelical weekend retreats, the cult had full control of the environment, which allowed them to use a series of tactics. They would make sure that every waking moment was crammed full of activities related to the cult. The individuals were not physically restrained from leaving, but a great deal of social pressure was put on them to stay. The lectures were made to last for hours at a time, and the other daily activities were intensive and all designed to make sure the attendees were in a regular state of fatigue. One attendee at a conference described it this way.
The whole weekend had the quality of a cheer, like one long, rousing camp song. What guests were expected to do was participate completely. That was stressed over and over. Give your whole self, and you'll get a lot back. The only way for this to be the most wonderful experience of your life is if you really put everything you have into it.
When divine precept first came to American shores, it picked up the outcast and disaffected because it gave them some place to belong. In this new, blossoming phase of the cult, it picked up new members by surrounding them in an atmosphere of love, making dedicated and elaborate efforts to make it seem as if everyone in the room were entirely devoted to this new person. Visitors to a weekend retreat at the farm were offered the opportunity to stay on a day or two for an extended workshop. If they did, they were invited once more to hang around. These invitations extended indefinitely until the person was a member by default. At a certain point, the person was no longer staying because of the bliss of the experience, but rather because of the implicit threat toward them, should they consider leaving. Thereafter, any doubts the person expressed would be condemned as acts of Satan. By default, most people tempted and later pressured to stay on this way did not have much of a life to return to. Otherwise, they would have left when they still had the chance. Here's a quote from a new member who was sent out into the world again to do some task for the church after 3 weeks of isolation at the farm. She says,
Being out in the world again was a shock, a cultural shock in which I was unable to deal with reality. My isolation by the church had been so successful that everyday sights, such as hamburger stands and TVs, even the people, looked foreign, of another world. I had been reduced to a dependent being. The church had seen to it that my 3 weeks with them made me so vulnerable and so unable to cope with the real world that I was compelled to stay with them.
This describes what scientists have called a re-entry problem. To understand the re-entry problem, try and think back to a time when you went on a really great vacation, or an extended stay at a friend's house, or even winter or spring break. You eventually have to go back home, back to work, and once you get there, it's an uncomfortable experience. Everything seems new or different or unfamiliar, and you sort of want to go back to the vacation, or the friend's house, or go back home when you have to go to work. So that is the story of the strange cult, which researchers studied in order to come up with the first groundbreaking model of religious conversion. In the modern year, some 40 years later, I can't find much material on the group's modern activities. It's definitely died down a bit, if not completely. So that is the story of the Divine Precept, a strange cult that inadvertently gave the world a foundational model of religious conversion. Most researchers find the Laughlin-Stark model to be out of date, and Laughlin himself made several revisions to his model over the years. But nevertheless, this model is considered foundational, and most models of conversion still build on these grounds these researchers broke as they looked into this bizarre Korean religion.